Welcome to the Reel Debrief, the show where we dive deep into the world of film production, exploring the genres you love, the projects making waves, and the trends shaping the industry. We're here to give you a 360-degree review for entertainment professionals. So grab your popcorn and get ready for some expert insights. And, well, the occasional bed joke from Talen. It's the Reel Debrief. Now your hosts, Talen and Lisa.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Reel Debrief. I'm Talen, your guide through the best of indie cinema. And, as always, I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Lisa.
Hey Talen. Hey everyone. I'm really excited about today's episode because we're diving deep into something pretty special. Nathan Silver's new film, Between the Temples. This film has been making waves for its portrayal of Jewish American life, and with its cast of talented actors, including Jason Schwartzman and Kane, it's a movie that has a lot to say about tradition, identity, and the tension between religious practice and secular life. There is so much to unpack here, Talen.
Oh, you know there is. This is a film that's rich in nuance, combining deep emotional themes with sharp, biting humor. For our listeners who might not be familiar, Between the Temples is an indie film that takes a somewhat unorthodox look at Jewish life in America, focusing on a cantor named Benjamin Gottlieb, played by Jason Schwartzman, who is in the midst of a crisis after the death of his wife. Lisa, before we dive into the plot, let's start by talking about something that really caught my attention. The fact that Hollywood, despite being built largely by Jewish founders, has produced so few films that directly depict Jewish American life. Why do you think that is?
That's such an important point, Talen. It's fascinating when you think about it. Most of the founding figures behind Hollywood's major studios were Jewish, yet so few mainstream films actually explore Jewish American life. One reason could be the desire, especially in the early days of Hollywood, to assimilate and appeal to a broader, non-Jewish audience. There was a fear that if studios focused too much on Jewish themes, it could alienate mainstream America, which at the time had its own cultural prejudices. Hollywood was a business, and these studio heads didn't want to risk their financial success by focusing on what was then considered a niche identity.
Okay, gotcha. So instead of highlighting their own culture, they often gravitated toward universal themes or stories that weren't tied to any specific ethnic group. Okay. But it's interesting how, over time, independent filmmakers like Nathan Silver have stepped into telling these stories, and how the indie film scene has become a space where Jewish identity, along with other marginalized identities, it can be more fully explored. Films like The Plot Against Harry, Hester Street, and more recently, A Serious Man and Armageddon Time really broke through in this regard.
Exactly. And what's great about Between the Temples is that it continues in this tradition of indie films that aren't afraid to tackle the complexities of Jewish life head-on, without watering it down for mainstream consumption. Silver's film really delves into the tension between secular Jewish life and religious practice. It's not just about identity. It's about the intersection of tradition, personal loss, and how people relate to religion in a modern context. That's what makes it stand out.
All right, yeah. So let's get into the plot a bit more. In Between the Temples, we meet Benjamin Gottlieb, a cantor at a small synagogue in upstate New York. He's played by Jason Schwartzman, as I said. And when the film opens, he's taken a sabbatical after the death of his wife, Ruth. He's completely lost his ability to sing, both physically and emotionally, because of his grief. Now, what I love about this setup is that it's not just about a man's personal loss. It's about his struggle with his role in the synagogue and his place within the Jewish community. I mean, it's a deeply personal story, but it also taps into these larger questions about religious identity and tradition.
Exactly. And one of the things that Silver does so well is create this intimate portrayal of grief. Ben's grief over the loss of his wife has paralyzed him, not only emotionally, but in his religious duties. The fact that he's a cantor, A person whose voice is literally their instrument for guiding others through prayer and worship adds another layer to his character's struggle. When Ben attempts to return to the synagogue and sing again, he fails, and his frustration culminates in a rather dark moment where he lies down in the middle of the road, essentially waiting for something drastic to happen.
Yeah, it's such a striking moment, and one that could have been played in a much more tragic tone, but instead, Silver seems to inject this scene with a sardonic humor instead of tragedy. Ben ends up in a bar, getting into a fight, and that's where he reconnects with Carla O'Connor, played by Carol Kane. It's such a bizarre, unexpected turn, but one that really sets the tone for the rest of the film, this blend of melancholy and humor that runs through every scene.
Oh, Carol Kane is fantastic in this film. She plays Carla O'Connor, Ben's former elementary school music teacher who reconnects with him in the most unlikely of circumstances. Her character is really interesting because she's this older woman who, like Ben, is also somewhat lost in life. She's had a series of mini strokes, she's been pushed out of her job, and she's searching for something to give her life meaning. And this is where the film takes another unexpected twist. Carla decides she wants a bat mitzvah and asks Ben to help her prepare for it.
Yeah, it's such an odd but beautiful request. At first, Ben is skeptical. Carla doesn't seem like someone who's particularly connected with Judaism. In fact, she was born Carla Kessler to communist parents who raised her without any religion. But despite all of that, she feels this pull toward Jewish tradition, toward reclaiming something that was never really hers to begin with. It's a fascinating dynamic because in helping Carla prepare for her bat mitzvah, Ben starts to rediscover his own connection to his faith, and in a way, his voice.
It's such a clever way to explore the film's deeper themes. Carla's journey to rediscover her Jewish identity is both comedic and touching, and it's through her that Ben begins to heal. She teaches him belly-breathing exercises to help him regain his ability to sing, which is an intimate, non-sexual form of connection that allows Ben to let go of some of his grief. It's like they're both using Judaism as a way to ground themselves in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and disconnected.
Yeah. But speaking of humor, this film is so rich in its comedic elements. Silver doesn't shy away from poking fun at Jewish life and traditions. But what's great about it is that humor never feels mean-spirited. It's more like a loving satire. And it's clear that even while he's poking fun, Silver has a deep affection for the characters and the world they inhabit.
Totally. The humor in Between the Temples is sharp, but it's also tender. For example, Ben's moms, his biological mother Mira and her wife Judith, are constantly trying to set him up with eligible Jewish women. They've even gone so far as to create a J-date profile for him without his knowledge, which leads to this really funny and awkward encounter with a woman named Leah. And then there's Rabbi Bruce Koenig, played by Robert Smigel, who's also trying to match Ben with his daughter Gabby. There's this sense that everyone in Ben's life is trying to move him forward, even as he's stuck in place.
Yeah, and these matchmaking attempts are both hilarious and painfully awkward. It's clear that Ben isn't ready to move on from his wife, but he's constantly being pushed into these uncomfortable situations. There's a great line where he's meeting one of these women, and he's so nervous that he blurts out, "Do you think I need work done?" It's such a perfect moment of self-deprecation, but it also speaks to his deep insecurity.
And that's where the humor truly shines. It's not just there for laughs, it's part of the character development. Ben is a deeply insecure person, and his interactions with these women highlight just how lost he feels. Even though his moms and Rabbi Koenig have good intentions, their attempts to push him forward only make him feel more stuck. It's a brilliant way to use humor to explore deeper emotional truths.
Okay, now, I also want to talk about how the film handles Jewish rituals and traditions. There's this tension between Ben's secular life and the religious rituals that are still a big part of his world. For example, there's a scene where Ben watches a VHS recording of his own bar mitzvah with Carla. It's such a powerful moment because you can see him grappling with what his faith means to him now in the aftermath of his wife's death.
That's one of the things that makes this film so compelling. Silver isn't just showing Jewish rituals as a backdrop. He's using them to explore how people relate to their faith in deeply personal ways. For Ben, the rituals of Judaism are both comforting and confining. They're a part of his identity, but they also remind him of everything he's lost. Watching his bar mitzvah video with Carla is such a poignant moment because it's a reminder of a time when he was connected to his faith, to his community, and to his own sense of purpose. But now all of that feels distant. He's going through the motions, but he's not sure if he still believes in what any of it means.
Exactly. And then there's Carla, who's coming to Judaism later in life, trying to understand these rituals for the first time. She's learning liturgy and Hebrew prayers, but what's so interesting is that she doesn't approach it with the same reverence that you might expect. She's irreverent, a little clumsy with the rituals, but she's also deeply earnest in her desire to connect with something larger than herself.
Right, and that's what makes their relationship so special. Ben, who has spent his whole life steeped in these traditions, is jaded and disconnected, while Carla, who is just discovering Judaism, brings a fresh, if unconventional, perspective. She doesn't follow the rules in the way that Ben does, but that's exactly what helps him rediscover his own connection to Judaism. Their relationship becomes a kind of give and take, where they're both learning from each other.
Okay, now, one of the things that Between the Temples does so well is explore the tension between religious tradition and modern secular life. Ben's life is so entrenched in Jewish tradition, but at the same time, he's trying to navigate a world that doesn't necessarily align with those traditions. For example, we see him struggling with things like his kosher diet or his fantasy of converting to Catholicism to win his late wife an afterlife.
Yeah, that scene where Ben imagines converting to Catholicism is a great example of how Silver mixes humor with deeper philosophical questions. It's absurd, but it's also really touching. Ben is so desperate for some kind of spiritual resolution, some way to bring his wife back to him in an afterlife, that he's willing to entertain this completely unthinkable idea of converting. It's a moment that highlights just how conflicted he is about his own faith and what it can offer him in his grief.
Yeah, and it's not just about Ben's personal struggle. There's a broader commentary here about how people navigate their religious identities in a modern secular world. I mean, Silver is really smart about how he portrays this tension. On one hand, you have characters like Ben's mom and Rabbi Cohen, who are deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and want to preserve it, and on the other hand, you have Ben and Carla, who are trying to figure out how, or even if, those traditions fit into their lives anymore.
And Silver doesn't offer easy answers to that question. He allows his characters to exist in this gray area where they're neither fully committed to nor completely rejecting their faith. For Ben, his relationship with Judaism is something he's constantly questioning, and that's something that a lot of people can relate to. There's this push and pull between wanting to hold on to the comfort and structure that religion provides, while also feeling constrained by its rules and expectations.
Yeah. All right, so, let's talk about the visual style of Between the Temples for a moment, because I think it plays such a crucial role in telling this story. The film was shot by Sean Price Williams, who's worked with Nathan Silver before. His handheld cinema verite style really adds a lot to the film's emotional impact. So my question for you, Lisa, is what do you think about the cinematography?
Oh, I thought it was brilliant. Williams has this incredible ability to make the camera feel like an active participant in the story. There's this intimacy to the way the scenes are shot. His handheld work gives the film a kind of rawness, like we're right there in the middle of the room with these characters, experiencing everything with them. It's not polished or overly stylized, which works perfectly for a film like this that's all about the messy, complicated realities of life.
No, I totally agree with that. The way the camera moves almost mirrors Ben's emotional state throughout the film, right? There's this kind of frenetic energy at times, especially in scenes where Ben is feeling lost or overwhelmed. And then at other times, the camera is still, almost contemplative, allowing us to sit with the characters in their more quiet, reflective moments.
Yes, and I think that also ties into the film's themes of uncertainty and searching for meaning. The handheld style creates this feeling of instability, which reflects how Ben is feeling internally. He's searching for something, whether it's his voice, his faith, or just a sense of direction in his life, and the camera's movement helps convey that sense of being off balance.
Yeah, and I love how the visual style also plays with light and shadow. There are moments where the lighting is really stark, almost harsh, and then there are these softer, more naturalistic moments that feel warm and intimate. I mean, it's a great way to visually represent the film's emotional extremes, in my opinion. From the melancholy and grief that Ben's dealing with, to the tender, sometimes absurd moments of humor.
Definitely. And the way the camera captures these off-kilter, unexpected moments of action or dialogue really adds to the film's charm. Every scene feels alive with possibility, like anything could happen at any moment. It's a visual style that perfectly complements the screenplay, which blends humor, sadness, and surprise in equal measure.
All right, now, one of the things that really stuck with me while watching Between the Temples is how personal it feels. Nathan Silver has a history of making films that are rooted in his own life experiences, right? I mean, his previous films like Soft in the Head and Uncertain Terms often feel autobiographical in the way that they explore family dynamics, relationships, and identity. And in this film, you can really feel that sense of personal connection, don't you think?
Absolutely. What's fascinating is that Between the Temples was partly inspired by Silver's own mother, Cindy Silver, who has appeared in several of his films. In fact, her own experience with having a bat mitzvah later in life provided the spark for this film. There's something very intimate about that, this idea of taking personal, familial experiences and using them as a foundation for storytelling. It's clear that Silver is not just drawing on his own life, but also on the lives of those closest to him.
And I think that's what gives the film such emotional depth. Silver isn't just making a movie about Jewish rituals or community, he's making a film about his own relationship with those things. I mean, there's a kind of vulnerability to that, and it makes the film feel more authentic. Even though the story is fictional, it's rooted in something real, something lived.
Exactly, and that personal connection extends to the characters too. Ben's journey feels so specific to him, but at the same time it's universal. We've all experienced grief, loss, and the struggle to find meaning in the wake of those things. Silver taps into those emotions in a way that feels both personal and relatable, and that's what makes the film resonate on such a deep level.
So we've touched on this a bit already, but let's really dive into the performances, because Jason Schwartzman and Carol Kane are phenomenal in this film. Schwartzman is known for his roles in Wes Anderson's films, and he brings that same kind of quirky, understated charm to the role of Ben. But there's also this deep vulnerability to his performance that I don't think we've seen from him in quite this way before, right?
Yeah, Schwartzman is really fantastic here. He's always had this ability to play characters who are a little offbeat, a little awkward. But in Between the Temples, he takes that to another level. Ben is a character who is completely out of sorts. He's lost his wife, his ability to sing, and his sense of purpose. Schwartzman conveys all of that with such subtlety. There's this constant tension in his performance between wanting to move forward and being completely stuck in place.
And then there's Carol Kane, who brings so much warmth and humor to the role of Carla. I mean, she's one of those actors who can deliver a line that's both hilarious and heartbreaking at the same time. Her chemistry with Schwartzman is incredible. I mean, they have this really unique, non-romantic, but deeply intimate relationship that drives the emotional core of the film.
Absolutely. Kane's performance is so layered. On the surface, she's this eccentric, slightly unhinged character who barges into Ben's life with her own agenda. But as the film progresses, you see that Carla is just as lost as Ben is. She's searching for something too. Kane brings this fierce energy to the role, but there's also a vulnerability to her that makes Carla feel so real and relatable.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So, Lisa, as we begin to wrap things up, where do you think Between the Temples fits in the broader landscape of Jewish American cinema? It's obviously a very personal film, but it also feels like it's part of a larger tradition of films that explore Jewish American identity, tradition, and tension between modernity and religion. So, how does it fit into that lineage? And what does it bring that's new or different in your opinion?
That's a great question, Talen. I think Between the Temples fits beautifully into the canon of Jewish American cinema, but it also brings something fresh to the table. Historically, films that explore Jewish identity often center on themes of generational conflict, cultural assimilation, and the balancing act between religious tradition and secular life. You see that in films like Fiddler on the Roof, A Serious Man, or Annie Hall. But what Silver does in Between the Temples is take these familiar themes and approach them from a uniquely personal and contemporary angle. One key difference is the way Silver brings humor to the forefront without losing the emotional gravity of the character's experiences. There's a kind of irreverence in his portrayal of Jewish life that feels very modern, very today. The characters are navigating their Jewish identities, but not in a heavy-handed way. It's more about how these traditions and cultural expectations intersect with their personal crises, grief, and insecurities.
Yeah, exactly. What really stands out to me is how the film explores Jewish life in a way that's both critical and affectionate. I mean, there's this sense of frustration with the routines and formalities of religious life. Ben's mom's consistently meddling, Rabbi Koenig trying to push Ben into dating, the awkward bake sale to raise funds for a Holocaust Torah restoration. But it's never mean-spirited. Instead, Silver uses these moments to show the characters' humanity, their flaws, and how they try to navigate their relationships with tradition, even when it feels overwhelming or outdated.
And I think that's what makes Between the Temples so relevant today. It's not just about religious identity. It's about how people, especially those in their 30s and 40s, are struggling to find meaning in institutions that sometimes feel disconnected from their personal realities. For Ben, Judaism is something that's both deeply ingrained in him, but also something he's questioning. It's like he's trying to figure out what parts of his faith still resonate with him and what parts he can let go of. That's something a lot of people, regardless of their religion, can relate to in our increasingly secular world.
Right. And even though this is a film specifically about Jewish life, the themes it deals with, grief, identity, community, finding your place in the world, are so universal. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think this film will resonate with a wider audience, even beyond those who are familiar with Jewish customs or culture. Silver is asking these big questions about how we cope with loss, how we find our voice after we've been silenced by grief, and how we navigate expectations placed on us by our families, our communities, and even by ourselves.
Another thing I want to touch on before we wrap up is the role that indie cinema plays in telling these kinds of Jewish stories. As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Hollywood hasn't traditionally focused on Jewish American life in a meaningful way, but indie filmmakers like Silver have really stepped in to fill that gap. Do you think that's because indie films allow for more creative freedom and the ability to explore these more niche personal stories?
I mean, okay, as I've said before, I think that's absolutely part of it. Indie cinema, by its nature, tends to be more personal and less concerned with mass appeal, which, of course, allows filmmakers like Silver to delve into very specific cultural experiences without worrying about alienating a broader audience. Between the Temples doesn't shy away from portraying the monotony of Jewish life. Shabbat dinners, Hebrew schools, synagogue politics, but it also doesn't feel the need to explain or justify those elements to an audience that might not be familiar with them. I mean, what's really exciting about this is that it allows for a much more authentic and nuanced portrayal of Jewish life than we typically see in mainstream films. I mean, Silver isn't trying to make a film that's about being Jewish in some kind of grand, all-encompassing way. He's telling a very specific story about specific characters, and their Jewishness is just one part of who they are.
That's such an important distinction. I think a lot of mainstream films that touch on Jewish themes can sometimes feel like they're trying to represent the entire Jewish experience, which is, of course, impossible. What Silver does is narrow the focus to this one story, these particular individuals, and by doing so, he ends up capturing something much more universal about faith, loss, and identity. It's a deeply personal film, but because of that, it feels more authentic and relatable.
Yeah, it feels so much more authentic. Okay, so, Lisa, after diving deep into all of these aspects of Between the Temples, what's your final takeaway? What do you think makes this film stand out, not just as a piece of Jewish American cinema, but as a film in general?
I think what makes Between the Temples stand out is its ability to balance humor and grief in such a nuanced way. It's a film that's about deep loss and personal crisis, but it's also incredibly funny, warm, and full of life. Silver doesn't shy away from the messy, complicated emotions that come with grief and religious questioning, but he also infuses the film with moments of absurdity and joy. That balance between the melancholy and the humorous is what makes the film feel so real and so human. And beyond that, I think it's the performances that really elevate the film. Jason Schwartzman and Kane are both so perfectly cast, and they bring so much depth to their roles. They take these characters, who could have easily become caricatures, and make them feel incredibly real and relatable. Their chemistry is wonderful, and their dynamic drives the emotional core of the film.
Oh yeah, their chemistry and dynamic makes all the difference. For me, Between the Temples is a film that resonates on so many levels. It's a story about grief, yes, but it's also a story about rediscovering your voice, about community, and about how we find meaning in our traditions, even when they feel outdated or confining. It's a film that feels both deeply personal and universally relatable. That's a hard mark to hit, and I think it's going to stick with people long after they've seen it.
Absolutely. Whether you're coming into it from a place of familiarity with Jewish culture or not, I think there's something in this film for everyone. It's a story about loss and healing, about finding connection in unexpected places, and about how our traditions can both comfort and challenge us. It's beautifully shot, brilliantly acted, and filled with so much art and humor.
Absolutely. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Between the Temples is such a rich, layered film, and I hope we've done it justice in our discussion. If you haven't seen it yet, definitely check it out. It's a film that's worth multiple viewings because there is so much to unpack emotionally and thematically. Now, I know I'll be thinking about it for a long time, and I'm sure our listeners will feel the same.
Absolutely. It's one of those films that keeps revealing new layers the more you think about it. And even though we've touched on a lot of its themes, grief, identity, the tension between tradition and modern life, there's still so much more to explore. I encourage everyone to watch it and see what resonates with them personally, because it's the kind of film that meets you where you are emotionally.
Ah, very well said, Lisa. All right, and before we sign off, I just want to remind our listeners that indie films like Between the Temples really rely on word of mouth and community support. So, if you enjoyed the film, share it with others, write about it, and get the conversation going. Independent cinema needs that kind of love to thrive.
That's right. And speaking of supporting indie films, don't forget to keep an eye out for Nathan Silver's previous work too. Films like Soft in the Head and Uncertain Terms may not have gotten as much attention as Between the Temples, but they're equally fascinating in their exploration of human relationships and identity.
Couldn't agree more. Nathan Silver is a director who has a unique voice, and I think we're going to continue seeing great things from him. Even though Between the Temples feels like a culmination of his work so far, it's also a stepping stone to whatever he tackles next. I, for one, can't wait to see what that is.
Same here, Talen. It's exciting to see a filmmaker with such a clear vision and a deep understanding of character and emotion. I'm sure whatever Silver does next will be just as compelling, and I can't wait to dive into those discussions too.
All right, and as we wrap up, let's give our listeners a little preview of what's coming up to the Silver Screen Breakdown. Next week, we'll be taking a closer look at another indie gem, this time from a completely different genre. We're going to be breaking down a recent sci-fi indie that's been flying under the radar, but definitely deserves a lot more attention. Any guesses, Lisa?
Ooh, I think I know which one you're talking about, Talen, but I won't spoil it. Let's just say it's a film that really pushes the boundaries of what we think of as science fiction, while still telling a deeply human story. I'm excited to dive into that one.
I mean, it's going to be a fun discussion. So, definitely tune in for that. And as always, we love hearing from you, our listeners. Let us know your thoughts on Between the Temples. Did it resonate with you? What stood out? And what are your thoughts on Jewish representation in indie cinema?
Yes, please do. You can reach us on social media or leave us a comment wherever you listen to podcasts. We always love hearing your take, and who knows, your thoughts might even make it into a future episode.
All right, well, that's all for today, folks. Thanks so much for joining us for another deep dive into indie cinema. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion of Between the Temples and that you'll check it out if you haven't already.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, as always, and I can't wait for our next conversation.
Same here, Lisa. And to all of you listening, thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Silver Screen Breakdown, where we keep the conversation about independent cinema alive and thriving. Until then, keep watching great films and sharing them with the people around you.
Take care, everyone, and see you next time.
This has been the Reel Debrief. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, like, rate, and review. We'll see you soon on the Reel Debrief.